This is Richard Miniter for Pajamas Media. I'm joined today by Paul Belien, the editor of the Brussels Journal, probably the leading website of Europe and the changes occurring in Europe, the rising anti-Semitism, the frightening wave of radical Islamic thought and action. And Paul has often been on the forefront of reporting stories from Europe that the MSM have buried. He was a contributor to the Wall Street Journal over the last 2 decades, the Wall Street Journal Europe, I should say. And he's appeared in many major magazines in Europe and the United States. And he joins us now in Washington, D.C., outside Morton's. Paul, welcome to Washington.
Thank you, Rich.
Now, the Brussels Journal was a real pioneer in reporting a lot of stories that people have missed, including the latest story we saw today in Le Figaro about the French intelligence having a report about a new intifada, possibly in France. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the French newspaper Le Figaro has a reference to a secret document of the French Secret Services, where the French Secret Services are actually saying that they're in these suburbs surrounding Paris, that Muslim Islamist youths are actually planning new attacks on the police, and that this is no coincidence. This has all been planned before, and even in a military fashion.
Now, these are very well organized youths. This is not spontaneous, according to what you're hearing. And at the Brussels Journal, you were among the first to report on the original series of French riots, which so traumatized France and surprised the United States. And it looked like there was coordination from a central point at that point as well.
That's certainly true. It's not too difficult for us to report about this because we're actually, well, to draw public for this because we're actually one of the few sources that report about this, and it is certainly a fact that the mainstream media don't want to report. They take a bit the attitude that if you don't write about it, that people won't know what's going on in these suburbs, but people, of course, know and they look for information, and we're one of the sources where they can find this.
Your website was the first to break the story for the English language media about the Danish cartoons and the Islamic reaction to them. Tell us a little bit about how you found that story and why you identified it as important long months before the other media bothered to notice.
Well, yeah, we with the Brussels Journal, we've got a kind of a network all over Europe, and I had a correspondent who was living in Scandinavia, and when the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten last year on 30th of September published these cartoons, this immediately created a row in Denmark.
But nowhere else?
No, nowhere else at the moment, but my correspondent was reading the Danish press, and he was listening to Danish radio and television, and he was also reading Danish bloggers. So he translated, or he retold the story for us in English. And gradually this whole affair escalated, and at the time first there were some imams protesting, and they went to Islamic embassies in Denmark who tried to get the Danish authorities censor this newspaper. Then the United Nations stepped in, and all the time the mainstream media outside of Denmark didn't report about this, so we did. And when the whole affair escalated into the attacks last February on the embassies in, I think in Lebanon and in some other countries.
Syria and so on.
And Syria and so on. Yeah, then people were trying to find more information, so they Googled for Danish cartoons, and they found their way to our website.
You were the leaders in that story and in other stories. Now, Paul, you're a Belgian. Your site's in English and also in Dutch. You read German and French as well and speak those languages. And you have other reporters who speak other languages, so you've got a network across Europe. But why is it that the Brussels Journal's reporting these things and not the New York Times, the London Times, or some of the major papers?
Well, I think for the same reason as why the European mainstream media don't report about this. It doesn't fit into their ideological schemes, and they're all in favor of a liberal attitude where they all believe that all cultures can live peacefully together, and this is actually contradicting their ideological frame of thinking.
But it's more than just ideology, isn't it? There's not the same degree of free speech. There's no First Amendment in Europe or the European constitutions of the various member states. And in fact, you can be sued for writing something that's perfectly true in Europe. And so maybe they're afraid partly from lawsuits and from a less hospitable legal climate, not just ideology. Isn't that part of it?
Yeah, that's part of it, and that's certainly true. And we've run into some problems with legal authorities because we've written about things which, according to the authorities, or which they deem to be incitement to racial hatred, although we're just reporting about actual events that are really taking place.
Now, the Belgian police have actually come to your house twice for stories that you've written in the Brussels Journal. Tell us about that.
Yeah, one of the first. I got into a little bit of trouble when I wrote about a boy that had been killed in broad daylight during rush hour in Brussels Central Station, and I had written that the two men who had actually stabbed this boy and killed him, that they were predators. And according to the Belgian authorities, this was comparing people to animals and was a kind of degrading them, and so incitement to racial hatred. Second time I got into trouble with the authorities.
Hold on there. Because you used the word predators,
Yes.
and animals, there are predatory animals, they thought this was racism. This was their argument.
Yeah, that's the argument. The argument is actually that you should not say that anyone is an animal or compare them to animals. So that's yeah.
And the second time, the police came to your house for something that you posted on the Brussels Journal.
No, the second time, actually, I think it was a pretext. We've been homeschooling our children, and we've never had any problems with that. Actually, we've got 5 children, and 4 of them have already finished their homeschooling and are at university. The police came to my door and they said that that the homeschooling actually, which we did, wasn't according to the rules. But I think that's just a pretext to get at the Brussels Journal. They don't like what we're doing. They want to make life difficult for us. They want to distract our attention from what we're basically doing, and want to try to thwart the things we write.
So there is really no free speech in Belgium.
Well, it's not typically Belgian. I think it's all over Europe. The free speech, you see it's gradually being restricted. The situation grows worse. We've got more and more problems. Many people that fear, and some policemen in France actually say this, that we're heading for a civil war situation. The authorities don't like this to be said.
Wait a minute, civil war. Between whom and why?
Well, that's the French policemen who say it, you know, as you probably know, and that was the French intifada of last year, and we think it will start again soon. There have been some troubles with so-called immigrants, so-called youths, which are actually been controlled or belong to Islamist radical factions.
They're organized into cells.
Yes, and they're organized into cells, and
They have military ranks within those cells.
I don't know whether they really call it military ranks, but they're organized almost in a paramilitary way. And the French authorities who try or who say that they want to re-establish the authority of the French Republic send in the police. But of course, if you're confronted with a civil war, the policemen really can't do anything. You should actually send in the army, I think.
But that's rather difficult given the current composition of the army, isn't it?
Yeah, there are some, according to some sources, and I think they're true, although you can't find these figures confirmed, but according to some sources, up to 15% of the French army already consists of Muslims, and the French authorities are said not to be too certain about what the army will do if they send in the army.
Tell us what you're working on now at the Brussels Journal that might interest readers in the coming weeks.
We're actually following what's happening in France, and we're close on the story of what we think will become the second intifada in the French suburbs, and we follow all over Europe actually what the problems these countries are confronted with and which you can't find in the mainstream media.
The slow demise of Europe is a much bigger story than the mainstream media has let on. This conversation with Paul Belien is just a small glimpse into a much wider scope of disaster. Check out the Brussels Journal. Keep reading Pajamas Media. For Pajamas, I'm Richard Miniter.